Simon Cook es profesor adjunto de Agricultura Digital en la Universidad de Murdoch de Australia. Ha estado desarrollando usos de datos para la agricultura desde la década de 1990 y fue uno de los primeros en darse cuenta del poder de la experimentación en el campo, directamente en el campo de los productores, como un gran incentivo a la introducción del uso de datos y al proceso de cambio. O sea, experimentar directamente con los productores es una de las más poderosas herramientas para poder implementar los cambios. Y además que esos cambios estén centrados en el productor. Tiene más de 30 años de experiencia en la investigación aplicada a nivel mundial y ha estado prácticamente en todo el mundo. Está recién llegado de Colombia, es muy modesto con su español, pero lo habla bastante bien, pero la presentación va a ser en inglés. So, welcome Simon, and just begin.
Thank you Edmundo. Oh, thank you for this. Entonces, para mí, 3 disculpas. La primera es que el tema de on-farm experimentación es muy largo y en una hora realmente hay que hablar superficialmente del tema, no se puede profundizarse mucho. La segunda es que el tema es multidisciplinario y me imagino casi todos de nosotros estamos de agronomía acá, pero realmente ese tema necesita saber mucho más de sociólogo y también es un tema que depende mucho más en data y analytics y es por eso a veces es difícil para cruzar las disciplinas. La tercera es, como digo, el mundo. Y yo llegué a Colombia hace 6 meses más o menos y como escuchan, mi español es del niño, un niño taxista colombiano, entonces qué pena, pero tengo que presentarlo en inglés. Si hay unas preguntas en español o inglés, si Edmundo puede ayudarme, yo lo acepto con mucho gusto. Y si alguien quiere contactarme después, yo escribí mi correo electrónico por unas preguntas, pero ahora es mucho mejor para mí para hablar en inglés. On-farm experimentation to transform agriculture. I mean here experimentation done by farmers with farmers, not the experiments that we used to do, which was researcher experiments done on a farm. This is a farmer-centric process. And I developed this theme with 2 others, Myrtille Lacoste, who I work very closely with in Australia, but also she is now in University of Montpellier and developing the theme there with programs, and Matt McNee, who is a real agronomist to keep us honest. Now the theme is quite complex, so I've divided it into 8 different sections. The first is to just reflect on the need for transformation. Transformation is something bigger than change. The need for global transformation. We are in the most exciting sector in the world and it needs to transform, and it is transforming. And actually what I see in APROCID is that APROCID is very definitely at the frontier of transformation, and in fact I think it's actually ahead in many different ways. The second thing I want to talk about is the contrasting pathways for change. And here I talk about exogenous versus endogenous change. We want endogenous change, not outside-driven change. Then I switch to on-farm experimentation and talk a little bit about the origins of on-farm experimentation before moving to the section 4, which is a little bit about on-farm experimentation principles and practice. You need to see that. You're probably here to see that. The 5th part may seem odd, but here we have to talk about the value, creating and sharing the value. La palabra, Edmundo, es valorización del proceso. Because without value, without valorization, who's going to pay for the process? you have to look at this to actually get an endogenous process that is self-generating. So the sixth one is about scaling up. I don't know what the Spanish for scaling up is. Escalar.
¿Sí?
Escalar.
Escalar para hacerlo más amplio. Escalar en forma vertical o horizontal puede ser de dos formas. Es ampliar
Ampliar, okay. So amplification of the process, that's very important. And I see this happening through business model generation. You see the problem with multidiscipline. Here we are, agronomists. How come I ended up talking about business models? It's strange. The seventh point I want to make is just reflect again on the global outcomes of endogenous growth. And finally, I'll finish up just by pointing out that it's not just me in Australia or APRICID or other places. There is now a global network of research groups developing on-farm experimentation for real change. So, section 1, the need for change. This is the population of Argentina, projected over the next 100 years or so. You can see the population is going to grow to roughly 50 million. The scale on the left is in thousands of people. So, and then after about 2050, it's going to start declining. So that's interesting, but not too scary. If you compare there with South America, it's a very small part of the total growth of population in South America as a whole, which is going up towards 500 million before it declines in the latter part of the century. If you add the Caribbean in there, Latin America and Caribbean, there you get towards over 1 billion people. Again, the same kind of curve. Not too scary maybe, although if you were in Europe or North America, you might feel intimidated that at the moment the population of Latin America and the Caribbean is actually overtaking that of both Europe and North America combined. Still pretty big. Small compared to these kind of places. This is East and Southeastern Asia, not just China. Don't know what happened there. Not just China, but Southeast Asia is growing to about 2030, and then it starts coming down again, thanks to the one-child policy in China in the past. Look at this. Southern Asia, mainly India, still has very high fertility and growth rates and has no prospect of declining until well after 2060. And even then, that's at a massive 2.5 billion people. That's quite scary. And look at Argentina and South America, nothing compared to these. Don't know why it's doing that, but don't worry. Can you check that? Okay. This is the really scary one. Sub-Saharan Africa is only just beginning its growth. And it's going to grow to over 3.5 billion people, much bigger than China or southern India in the world. And it's going to need feeding itself. So the projections for population growth globally, it used to be 9 billion, then it was 9.3. Now the latest is about 10.4 billion people in 2100. And it doesn't slow down until after 2050. So a major problem here, a major problem, but also a major opportunity for food producers like Argentina. Now, to satisfy demand, we must grow more food. We're going to have to grow more food. And by and large, see if I can use the pointer. Is this the pointer? No, that's not the pointer. Doesn't matter. By and large, most of that growth is going to take place by the right-hand graph, which is the intensity of cropping. And most demand has to be met by increases in the intensity of cropping, except in sub-Saharan Africa. Está bien? Okay. Pointer here. Thank you. Except in sub-Saharan Africa, where we're going to see a continued increase in the cropping area, whereas most places the cropping area cannot increase. And this is one that resonates with the theme of this conference, agriculture cannot just increase as it has done in the past. It must do in a way that is more sustainable globally and also produces food that make people healthy. And here we have these areas here, these sectors here are outside what is considered to be the boundaries for growth, for sustainable growth. These must come back in. Grains must actually go back out. So we have a big issue here, a big opportunity, but also a demand to maintain and increase global sustainability. This is from this report here. I commend anybody to read it. It's very political, and it does kind of put down these things on the table, knowing that in reality, they're very difficult to achieve. Very few politicians in Africa are going to stop growth of their economy for global requirements. But at the same time, there are major changes both in the sustainability of production systems and in the quality for food. Okay, so the big picture really is this, is that it's not just about producing more, it's about producing more with knowledge. And the reason you have to produce more with knowledge, and these ideas come from these two economists. Again, I'm no economist, but we have to read these things sometimes. These are serious senior economists, even though the picture on the right of Paul Romer looks as if it's from his Tinder profile. But the point is that we cannot just produce more, we must do it in a certain way. And we have to do it through endogenous growth, which means knowledge growth. Now, there are two things about knowledge growth that are important. Is that the first is that if you just increase productivity, but you don't increase the knowledge growth or the capacity of the system that produces it, you're really just mining resources. So, for example, in Australia, we produce more, but a lot of that production has really just come by increasing the productive area and uses cheap land. We haven't really entered the phase, and in fact, we're only just entering the phase where the system is becoming more and more productive through endogenous growth. And so really, I'd say the Australian system has, by and large, been mining resources of cheap land. And so that's not good. But the good news is that if you focus on knowledge growth, increased productivity growth is effectively inexhaustible because there are always ways of doing things smarter and cleverer. And that comes through endogenous growth, knowledge growth. Okay, so a quick summary for that section. The first is that we're looking at a vast increase in global demand right through to 2100. That's good news. The good news too is that food systems must respond mainly through more intense and knowledgeable production. And that they must do this in a way which maintains and improves human and planetary health. And that this can only really be sustained. It can be done in the short term without these things, but it can only be sustained by endogenous growth in ways that respond to ever-changing demands. And from what I've seen about agriculture in Argentina, it is the world master at responding to very difficult, challenging political and economic conditions. It has that capacity, and that's really important. Without that, we won't survive globally. Okay, second point, second section is about the contrasting pathways to change. Now, you'll all be familiar with this, but I'll repeat it anyway. Is that the pathway for change that we were probably all trained with is this, is that research is supposed to develop insights or technologies, and that the insights or technologies go to farmers through extension services or extension systems from government or from researchers, and we hope that farmers change as a result of that. I would say that that is a very poor understanding of endogenous change, and I would say this is a better system. We talk about on-farm experimentation, but also on-farm innovation. How much of change that you know about was really generated off the farm? I'll bet most of it was actually aided by what happened in this traditional way, through special insights or through research products, but in actual fact, most change actually occurred on farm. And that's an alternative and complementary pathway that actually adapts scientific insights to scalable processes from what goes on the farm. So farmers actually contribute much more, perhaps, than we realize to on-farm innovation. It's just that it's often not captured, and it's not formalized in ways that we as researchers understand it. But I think it's important that we actually celebrate that change, and I see a lot of it too. And here in Argentina, I think a lot of it goes on. But important to actually celebrate this and understand that it is scientific, it is different. So contrasting pathways for change, if we talk about exogenous change, which is scientist-centric, it's not that it's bad, but it's different. And endogenous change, which is farmer-centric. If you think about the scientist-centric, tend to use a simplified question. We look at the system, we say, aha, the problem here is nitrification. So we focus on nitrification and forget everything else that the farmers have to do. We try and produce certain and generalizable results that you can publish. Every scientist has to publish. You can't publish if you don't have certain results. And you can't publish something that isn't generally important, but to other scientists. So often those results are of uncertain relevance to farmers. How does the farmer actually use those results for their day-to-day management decisions when they may be more preoccupied with how much money they're going to have to send their kids to school, or can they actually pay for the fertilizer bill this year? There are very few scientific papers that actually address those questions because they impact the farmer at the moment. And so often there are uncertain adoption rates. No-till farming is an exception. It has very high adoption rate because it's actually very simple technology that is usable by virtually all farmers. But most scientific research has low adoption rates. If you look at the farmer-centric or endogenous approach, the question is farmer-centric, is generated by or with farmers, not by scientists. And they can be more complex than we're used to as scientists. The results that we get are highly variable. The results that we get in on-farm experimentation, because they're big, and I did put one in at the last minute actually this morning, you'll see that they're extremely variable, and therefore the results are sometimes uncertain, difficult for scientists to accept, but in actual fact quite easy for farmers to understand. And in actual fact, I started with precision agriculture way back in the 1990s. We were the first people in Australia to produce yield maps for grains in I think it was about 1993.
Yes.
It was really, really early. And I'm a naive kind of guy, and I thought, these maps of yield variation are fantastic. The agronomists are going to love us because here we are, we have maps, we have actual data of the very thing that they want to know about, yield variations. So I went to see various colleagues, I worked in CSRO at that time. I went to see various colleagues to see if I could get them interested in this information. They weren't at all interested. They didn't want it. They didn't want to know. They used to have two things they used to say. They used to say, first of all, it's too variable. I can't work with that. It's too variable. There's too much uncertainty. And the second thing they used to say is it's too complex. There are too many factors acting within that one field or paddock for me to actually do my research. And I used to say, well, this is what farmers have to cope with every day. So you're saying basically your style of research cannot manage what's really out there in the land. And at that point, they used to leave my office and speak to them again. So the results are quite variable and uncertain, but they're often very relevant to farmers. farmers, when they see their results, they know what to do with them. They know to ignore 70% of the results in that particular year because there's 30% that is helpful to them. And therefore, they adopt these results very easily. If you can deliver the process, they adopt it. So two contrasting pathways. Now, are these pathways separate? How do you combine these? Well, I'd say, first of all, you have to realize that they're data-driven. You can get data for all of these situations. And the other thing I want to point out here is that scientists also have a really important function to bridge these two domains using models, very helpful, and also using process knowledge to help understand how these two actually link. And one thing that I've noticed is that often junior scientists have a lot of problems with some of these big, complex issues, because I don't know what it's like here, Edmundo, but in Australia and in many parts of the EU and probably in North America, junior scientists don't get field experience like they used to. I mean, maybe it's different here. If not, if it's different, then keep that, because without that, students cannot develop the knowledge of complex processes.
I'm not from the scientist environment, but I guess it's the same.
It's the same, okay. Real problem. So these days, if you look at papers in agronomy journals and elsewhere, you'll find that they're dominated by modeling. They're dominated by statistical modeling, which actually don't require any field experience to discriminate between a process that occurs in your laptop and something that really occurs on the ground under complex surgery. And that's a real issue there. Yeah. But that can be really helpful to bridge these two worlds. Okay, enough of the propaganda. Now let's get into how you actually do on-farm experimentation. This is an image, and I thank Rob Bramley from CSIRO for this, because I just threw away all that old data. This is an image from about 1994 of the first big on-farm experiment that we did. This is a wheat paddock or a field, about 72 hectares. We set up a nitrogen trial in this, almost by accident, actually. It was just a postgraduate student who wanted to develop a variable rate technology, and he actually wrote the code for the variable rate technologies. This was the first application of variable rate technology in Australia as well. And we started off by doing it as a fertilizer trial, nitrogen. Here we have 30, each of those lots there is about 30 meters by 30 meters. 4 levels, repeated, I think it was 200 times, something like that, over the paddock. Okay, now what's the first thing that you can see about that paddock with the checkerboard? It's highly variable, right? Huge variation. We found that many parts of the field or the paddock didn't respond to fertilizer, even though beforehand we had grid sampled and we knew exactly what the nitrogen levels were and we knew what the overall response should be. It didn't respond anything like the models told us it should. We were looking for all sorts of things, and the farmer was there and he said, "Welcome to my world. You know, this is what I have to deal with every year." The farmer wasn't at all fazed by this variation. Now, we thought we were very smart doing this in the 90s. We presented papers at the precision agriculture conferences, but found it difficult to get published because it was an unusual kind of idea. We thought it was very clever, but we found out subsequently that in actual fact, a lot of this kind of thinking had been done elsewhere in the CG, CIMMYT or CIAT and other places, but there they called it farming systems research, or they had a label participatory research. And these days, if you check it out, you'll see there's a lot under what they call learning alliances, which is farmer-centric change. None of these have data. That's the big issue. When we did this in the 90s, we found that farmers, every farmer we spoke to, wanted to try it out. we tried it out, and we tried some various kind of designs. Here are some of the weird ones. This wave, what we call the egg box design, was actually our second or third experiment. And we developed this over about 1,000 hectares. The farmer was a commercial farmer. He was completely unconcerned by it. Scientists thought it was really difficult, but the farmer had absolutely no problem with it. We developed checkerboards. On the left-hand side is a different design which mixes checkerboard with long strips. Long strips are pretty good, no problem here. Here is a simple enriched strip. These are done virtually everywhere these days. Just if you want to know, put in a strip and see what the results do. In the middle, a quite unusual one. Fernando, you'll know this probably from your IP&I days. This is actually an oil palm. That is a 6,000 hectare experiment in oil palm to test out the rate of fertilizer response. In all of these cases, we found that farmers were not too concerned, providing you designed them in a way that they could manage it quite easily. Scientists found it more difficult than farmers. So anyway, here we ended up, after some years of experience, which I've just picked up more recently, to learn some of the basic processes. The first one is that farmers organize because they're interested in learning and change. The second is that farmers inquire. They say, what happens if I do this on my land? And I don't know, we tended to think when we started that experimentation was new to farmers. But when we surveyed farmers in our state, in Australia, I don't know what percentage you have in your mind about what percentage of farmers actually experimented. And by experimentation, I don't mean just an error or trial and error, but a deliberate cognitive process whereby they say, I want to try this, and I'm going to do it here. And when they see the effect, they take that in as a cognitive process. We were quite surprised because in our area, the survey indicated that 83% of farmers actually experimented. It's their natural way of learning. The only farmers who didn't experiment were those who were either going bust and were just looking to sell the farm, or those who were going to retire and basically didn't want to learn anymore. All of the others actually experimented already. The third part of the process is that specialist support really helps. So scientist's role here is very clear. Let me help you with background, what do you understand already from the published literature? Farmers can't be expected to do that. The experimental design, that's quite easy and can actually be automated. And there is a company in Australia who actually offers this as a service. It's quite cheap. You pay per field to put in a standard experiment, actually a checkerboard. Helping with the data capture, that can be a nuisance for farmers. And in actual fact, we find that you may be better thinking about satellite imagery rather than yield monitor. And of course, analysis. You need a method of analysis. So the specialists have a role. The specialists and farmers together interpret the results. What happened? Where did it work? Where didn't it work? Why did it do so? And then what does it mean to my business or my process operations? And then the fifth one, very important, is the continued inquiry. Where do you go next? It's not a one-off process. It's a continual process of inquiry with people. And that's a social process. So here is just a quick shot of one experiment that we put in. It's not the best image. I'm sorry about that. But they were interested here in potassium fertilizer. Expensive. They wanted to know. So they just put out trials over this area here. That's roughly 1.3 kilometers along the strip. The farmer had no problem putting that in above and below their level. The farmers inquired, well, what happens if I vary K over this area? It's a big cost to me. I want to know what it does. We helped them put in the experiment and do the analysis. The farmer captured the data himself. We helped interpret it. This, on the right-hand side, is the image of the potassium effect. You can see, again, highly variable. Now, this isn't the best image or the best method. It was the first one I could grab. But immediately, the blue is good, the red is bad. You can see there are some areas where there's clearly a positive effect. And it's happy. Over about a third of the area, maybe. The strip in the middle is just where something went wrong. There was no data. The red areas where there was, it's not a negative effect, but a zero or a small negative effect. And those occurred mainly in areas that weren't going to perform very well anyway. And we found out with the continued inquiry that that was for a different reason, a different soil type. There were large areas where we just didn't know. It was too complex. So this was data that went into a process of farmer-based inquiry. And in actual fact, the farmer did two things as a result of this. The first is that he took more time to get the soil tested down the bottom end of the strip because it was basically a different soil type that didn't respond for another reason. The other is that he thought about putting more money into some of those areas, but not all, but then continue the inquiry. So it's a process of engagement around data. You must have data, otherwise you've got nothing to talk about. But it's about engaging with the growers, with the farmers, getting the data, doing the analysis, and then discussing the meaning and repeating. And this is from, again, an ex-colleague of Fernando's, but you can see it's what we call the racetrack. It's a continual process of engagement and analysis. Okay, section 4. We're more than halfway through. Don't worry, you're doing well. Some principles about OFE. And this image here is from an experiment, actually, that the farmer put in without any prompting. He just wanted to try something. And so he put in some different strips, different runs of actually summer cropping and see what the effect was. And these colors are from the next year's crop and looking at comparison of what the next year's crop actually did. The green areas are where the crop subsequently improved. The red are where they didn't improve. So we've generated a number of rules from not just this one, but from generally from the process of OFE. The first is to keep it farmer-centric. Ask what the farmer is interested in. If you're interested in a particular topic, that's great, but discuss it to see what the farmer thinks and what they want to do. We have a rule to keep it simple. This is a simple trial experimental design. It soon gets very complex because our third rule is keep it big. The reason for keeping experiments big are this. The first is that you can use normal farm machinery. And that's really important to growers, to farmers, that you need to be able to use not special machinery, but they're conventional machinery, and they need to be able to put in the experiment easily. The second reason is, again, what can you see in this result? A lot of variation. The variation in this case is clearly related to the underlying soil change. Now, if you had a normal plot trial, it would probably be in just one of those soil types and wouldn't tell you about what the whole area is doing. So going big is really important. And going big is also important for farmer learning. I don't know what your farmers are like, but our farmers learn by looking at the landscape. It's called kinesthetic learning. They understand their system within the landscape. Mm-hmm. And so to read that, you need to have big experiments, and you can do it. Our fourth rule is keep out of the way, because farmers are very busy people, and they don't like it when you pester them to do some analysis when they're too busy. And the fifth rule is basically keep exploring. So here we go. The first rule and second rule is there because farmers know their business better than scientists do. The rule about keeping it big is important because we got a lot of information in there, and it's got to be big, and farmers manage that without any trouble. The fourth one is quite important, keeping out of the way, because many farmers are time poor, and so you have to program your interaction with farmers importantly. And the fifth one, we thought we were very clever with this process of continual improvement and experiment, but it's just what Toyota have been doing for decades, the process of continual improvement. And that's the situation we're in. Okay, now here's a bit of a tricky one to appreciate, because again, we tend to focus on the agronomy, but the process actually requires input from 3 different disciplines. The science is in 3 different disciplines. The agronomy, you know very well. That actually helps you interpret the data and understand what the system's doing. The social sciences, that's a bit new to us, but you need to understand that there is science there to help you understand how farmers learn in groups and how they make better decisions, either individually and groups with data. And the third area, which is new to much of us, is about the data sciences. And the point about the data is it gives you much greater certainty for the process. So the thing works well by involving all 3 disciplines to the level you have to. Okay, step 5. This is the thing about value, acquiring value from OFEs. If you can read those statements, all of them are value creating. If you're a farmer, you go through the process. You learn from the experiment, this worked over here in this area here. Next level is, it worked over here, but it did not work down there. The third question, why did it do that? How much do I know about the system? Well, do I know why it worked here and why it didn't work here? Well, maybe, maybe not. Then you get into social learning. Does my advisor know why it worked here and why it didn't work down there? And then remember that the farmer was there last year and the year before. What do I know from my experience about the interpretation of this experiment? And so all of these questions, if you can answer them, can create value, make farmers more effective managers through more knowledge about their own system. And they tend to be worked in 3 different ways. First of all, there is the instantaneous answer. Potassium produced this gain over here. Instantaneous. There is the cumulative. It worked over here, but I don't think it's going to work here next year. I think it's going to be different. So that's a long-term learning process. And the other is about learning within organizations, in APRICID or others. So what do we know from all of our properties about how this thing creates? All of those questions and answers create value, enable farmers to be better managers, make more money from their operations. Okay, business models, 6th step. Again, this is a bit weird. This is a figure of a business model. The value proposition is what you think you're going to do better. What you think you're going to do better. But as somebody to actually develop a business out of this, you need to know, well, who's going to do it? So who are your customer segments and how are you going to keep in contact with them? The other thing about this is, are you an agronomist going to do all of this work? Or do you have to do some of it with other people? So you have to look at key activities, key partners, who's going to do what's needed to make the whole thing work. And then think about this, think about revenues and costs. Doing this work, doing on-farm experimentation actually costs time, money, and sometimes credibility. Okay, is the process going to generate enough benefit and demonstrate enough benefit to actually feed back into that and keep the whole process running? If you can't draw, if you have a good idea and you can't draw a diagram, something like this, you haven't thought out the idea well enough for it to be a self-sustaining process, and that's really important. Don't need to repeat this, but basically this is about what you have to do, what is the basic idea, anybody who wants to follow up on the presentation. Now, there's not just one type of business model, but there are various types of business model depending on where you come from. If you sell product, you have a certain type of business model. Maybe it's an input OFE, because you want to demonstrate how your product actually makes money for the farmer within the farmer's own operation. You might actually be more interested in land value. In that case, you want to know what's the measurable change that a good manager can demonstrate through OFEs, and these can be designed too. You might be like Apricid, a farming group OFE, where you're interested in different kinds of questions. You might actually be in product. How can I improve product quality from my providers, from my growers, using the OFP process? There's a range of different types of business models that you'll need to develop to actually make the whole process work. Okay, we're almost there. We're doing pretty well. Section 7 is about this, and it's about OFE actually grows data-enriched knowledge. Agriculture doesn't use much data. The figure on the left-hand side comes from a McKinsey report, again, that well-known agronomic journal, a McKinsey report where they looked at the adoption of digital technologies in 23 different sectors. Each of those rows is a different sector of the US economy. They did the same thing for the Australian economy and found the same. And the answer was that agriculture is at the bottom of the class, according to their method. Now that should concern us. In other words, agriculture, of all of those sectors, uses least digital technologies in its management processes. I think if you included all of the technology that agriculture uses, when you buy $500,000 worth of machinery, it comes with a lot of technology already built into it. If you buy new improved seed or agrochemical, that has a lot of digital technology built into its development. But in terms of the way farmers and others use digital technology, agriculture is the bottom of the class. And so OFE is a way to pull in more and more of that data and technology into the process through the OFE process and continuous learning. Again, these two gentlemen appear in that process as well. Now, it's not just me saying this, and when we started 30 years ago, we were, to my knowledge, the only people who were actually trying to do big-scale on-farm experimentation. But it's quite pleased that a few years ago found that there's a lot of people doing OFEs through research. So there's us in Australia, there's the KWS who actually are included in this, there is the China group who do the scientific backyard that has 1 million farmers involved in it. There's an awful lot going on in France and in the UK and in the EU generally. There is work going on in many universities in the US, and there was a USDA program that actually supported the development of a network. So we have a network of OFE researchers now that we're building on, and last year we had an OECD sponsored conference developing that, and we had over 200 contributions to that. So we have a body of research and science now to actually move forward. The question is, how can we actually develop this in a coherent scientific framework? And that's where we are now. So I put this slide in there just to show we're not alone. There are lots of people interested in these things, but if you check most of the literature, you'll find that on-farm experimentation doesn't appear generally in the scientific literature. I did actually include a paper that we wrote for Nature in that, just to show we have a level of scientific research now, but still trying to get those three disciplines together is quite difficult for researchers to get. So in conclusion, this is what I'd like to say about on-farm experimentation. We know there is a huge demand for change. That's written. We know that. The question is how is that change going to occur? And what I'd like to say is that on-farm experimentation is a farmer-centric contribution to that change process through endogenous knowledge growth. And it's not a separate or a conflicting pathway, but it should be complementary with all of the research that goes on. To get into on-farm experimentation, you just need 3 basics. The first is you need organization. Apricid is a fantastic organization for that. The KWS are also ways of getting people organized to actually learn together, because this is mainly a learning process. Very important to understand that. And the third thing that you do need to really accelerate it is data and analytics. Well, you will already have, I can guarantee, more than enough data You're probably already overwhelmed with data. If you want more, we can get it for you through satellite imagery. That can be done quite easily. The trick of all of this is how do you convert the idea of on-farm experimentation into a self-sustaining process. And I'm saying that's where the business models come in to actually scale up the process, not just to a few farmers, but up to hundreds or thousands of farmers. That's really important. And I'm saying to back you up, we actually have a global network of researchers forming to actually support that. So the question is, why not get involved much more? We could do much more together. So final messages. To those of you who are already using on-farm experimentation, and I hope there's some in the room doing that, or people you know who are doing that, I'd say to you, continue experimenting and learning. Don't be discouraged by the complications. I'd also say it's important to communicate within the learning groups so you understand what you're doing. And the third thing I'd say is try and get more data and perfect those methods to acquire more data and also manage more data. Because one thing I didn't talk about, but is very important in Europe, is IP protection and IP law. So to those of you who are looking at OFE and think, well, seems a good idea, but I'm not too sure how to do it, I would say the first thing to think about is joining an organization as a learning organization to help you develop those things. And then consult people, either your consultant, if you're a grower, or a supplier. If somebody wants to sell you more things, then why not engage with them in a process? Well, why don't we experiment on our land to see exactly what your product does for us, okay? Or a trader. If you have traders who want to know more about the product or where it comes from, who want to know more, for example, about certification, then that can be done through experimentation on farm that can provide data to demonstrate, to prove in numbers that you are producing things in the most economic and environmentally sustainable way in that system. So a lot to do there, and I imagine that 90% of people are kind of doing a bit of OFE, but want to get more involved, don't know how to do it. And I'd say do it within organizations, really important. To those of you who really don't want to experiment or learn on farm, well, you've got two options here. One is that you hope that an organization externally, Inter or somebody like that, actually produces exactly what you can use on your farm. It tends not to happen, but it might happen. You never know. The other thing you can do is enjoy your retirement, because I don't think it's a sustainable way to proceed. And with that message, I'd like to thank you very much. And gracias por su atención.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Simon. And maybe we have some questions.
¿En inglés o español?
No, maybe in English.
Okay.
I will translate you. No estoy mirando el celular, sino que voy a repetir el número del celular al que llegan las preguntas, para las dudas que alguno no lo haya tomado al principio de la charla. Lo repito, es el 0341 30 92 98 6. Así que pueden enviar por WhatsApp las preguntas a este número. Si lo querés repetir de vuelta más adelante, mejor, pero bueno. Lo volvieron a aguantar. Bueno, ahí lo tienen. Y bueno, cuando quieran podemos empezar. Yo ya tengo algunas, Simon. I have one for you. Good. You talk about the bridges between the scientists and the farmers. That scientists can build that bridges. How can they build that?
They can build a bridge in this way. The type of information that an OFE produces is very interesting to a farmer. It has what's called pragmatic content, but it's quite difficult to include in a scientific publication, for example. Mm-hmm. But the processes are there. And so for scientists to get involved to help explain how identified processes produce results on the field at field scale would be a great way to proceed. So we did have a project in Australia, for example, to help quantify what really happened to potassium fertilizer. And that involved a number of very large experiments, but also process specialists who could explain what really happened in the results. And it's an interaction, because of course the results that the scientists were expecting didn't appear by and large. Normally the effects were much smaller or much more varied than the scientists anticipated. But the researchers actually helped explain and quantify those results through examination. So there is interactions needed, Edmundo, between scientific specialists who can do the modeling or process-based modeling and the OFE, the practitioners who actually generate what really happens on the ground.
Bueno. Hay posibilidad también de hacer preguntas en vivo, así que...
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you very much. Interesting. It might not be the main topic of the presentation, but I assume there is a lot of knowledge that is being created in this type of information progress or experimentation progress. But the main question is, the challenge is that big, since what you presented, it's a global challenge. So my main question would be how we transform all that global network or all that knowledge that is created in small areas or medium areas into a really big impact solution, or so how we take all that APRESID is creating as a global solution, as from your experience. Thank you very much.
Okay, very good question, and a difficult one. In most industries, managers get paid for results. It doesn't tend to happen so much in farming in the way that it does in other industries. So the global change would actually be in the identifiable and recognized increase in management skill within difficult and complex environments. So you remember we have a number of different levels of knowledge. One is I know what to do now. Another is I know what to do over this area or over time. And the other one is I know what we're doing as an organization, a community of farmers. And many organizations actually try to quantify that in terms of rewards, performance and reward system. They don't tend to occur in agriculture, but I would say this is perhaps a way we actually need to move, that agriculture is recognized for its extreme skill in managing very difficult, complex environments and responding. And I would say the price of a product is one thing that's very important, or the value of product produced is one thing that's very important, but there are many other things that will become equally important, such as how sustainable is our system? What are the measures that we can demonstrate through large-scale experimentation and other forms? How can we demonstrate in numbers how our system is performing? And then thinking of the people, how can we demonstrate that our people are really know this stuff and are able to adapt? So it's a very good question, but a very complex answer. I'm sorry about that. But I would say that is the true definition of sustainability, is when people within the system, they have data, but they know what to do with the data to actually improve the system performance. And the people managing those systems actually reward people who have proven capacity to actually do what you want the system to do.
Another question is, do you know about the chakras system, APRESID chakras program?
I know something of it. I know of its existence,
okay.
and I know of its process, and it seems to me perfect as a platform to include this.
And there is a potential to develop contacts across the global network?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely, we can do that.
Might you briefly describe the data analysis tool used at the global network? Or?
Okay, there are about 1,000 data analytical tools, but they range from simple comparison of one thing with another thing, because remember, we are also developing systems in Africa where you don't, where you have a small half a hectare lot, and you need to compare hundreds of those with other hundreds of those. So different types of methods. If you're most interested in the large-scale experiments, we have 2 or 3 main techniques, and anybody who wants to contact me can do so to identify not only the total effects of the experiment, but also you want to identify the spatial variation of effects, because that's often the thing that is most interesting. Do they need me to go into details of those spatial analytical methods?
Maybe
afterwards. If
they can
somebody wants
reach you
to contact me, I'm very happy to help going through some of those. We have simple methods and complex methods. The graphic that I showed you in the presentation, it was actually quite a simple method that we chose because it could be automated, and there are companies who offer software and processes to do this automatically. My view is that the results are often more useful and create more value when you do the analysis and you interpret the results with specialists. I think you get much more learning through that process. So,
I see in the news angry farmers around the world about the climate agenda of their governments, and how does it work with these improvements?
Okay.
There's an antagonist between researching and what the government wants or the people.
Well, here's a way of doing it. So imagine you're a Dutch farmer, and I don't know, you probably know they're facing extreme restrictions on use of nitrogen.
Yes.
Supposing but the problem is at the moment is that those restrictions are blanket restrictions. Everywhere they have the same problem. Supposing instead of saying we will restrict nitrogen use to this because of climate change impacts, we will set up a process whereby you will show us that you are developing a process to reduce nitrogen use without reducing productivity. An on-farm experimentation would be a way to do that, whereby you could demonstrate on which parts of the landscape you're able to apply more, and in which parts of the landscape really you do need to reduce. So I would say in that case, you use on-farm experimentation to generate data and results to support a learning process. It's just a different kind of learning process that responds to change.
Okay. I had the opportunity to see in New Zealand and maybe in UK that the farmers are on the board of the government research organizations, and it doesn't happen here. The INTA, there are maybe one farmer in the board and no more than that. And how it works that there must be more farmers on the boards, or what do you see?
Must be more farmers or farmer representative. I don't know if you in Australia the main grains research organization is actually dominated by farmers. Now that has its own problems because the process can get very political, but it does ensure that all the research or most of the research has some pathway to impact. Globally through the world, and I do a lot of work with international organizations as well, these days they are insisting on something that's called a theory of change, which is whereby you have to say how your research is going to deliver impact, and you have to specify. It's never true exactly because it's just the best estimate of how your research will deliver impact, but if you have to identify what are the real outcomes, likely outcomes of your research, and how are you going to measure those outcomes, it really improves the quality of science in my view. And this was one of the main strengths of CSIRO, the research organization that I used to work for. Our CEO actually stood up in front of the organization and said, I don't really care how many publications you write. That doesn't really interest me. He said, you have to write those publications because that's how you learn your science. But he said, what I really want you to tell me is what are the changes that your research creates that I can report back to politicians. So I think to answer your question, Mundo, the way to improve the deliverability of research is to identify how the research produces farmer-based outcomes. Yeah.
Okay. Hay otra pregunta en el salón. Hay otras, perdóname, ahora te toca.
Hello, good morning. I think that we are farmers that we are producing in a world where we cannot add more land to produce crops due to sustainable process and due to environmental issues. So I think that the only way to produce more food is to improve knowledge and improve technical in growing crops. But do you think that all of this will be big enough to satisfy the demand of crops in an increasing worldwide population, as you have shown in a graphic before, that you say that the population in 2100 will increase nearly duplicate the population that we have today?
And don't forget, you've got to do it while you adapt to the effects of climate change, and you can only do it keeping within the planetary boundaries. I actually think it can be done. The analysis that I've done suggests that very few areas in the world are at their potential. Some areas are close to their potential, so North America, most of North America and maybe most of Europe, parts of China, small part of India, very small parts of Africa are really near their potential. But if you look at large areas of the world, there's huge areas of the world that are nowhere near their potential. And so I would be optimistic that it's possible, but only if we organize and actually couple research to change on the ground. And I don't think, that's kind of my point, is that I don't think we're going to achieve what's going to be needed using the old way of change. I think we must have a combination with a much more farmer-centric way whereby you actually build in knowledge into the process. So I do think it can be done. And I also think that Argentina and Latin America actually is really important in this because it has a relatively small population, so it's a huge food exporter. I mean, in Colombia, where we're from, it's about the quality of produce, the quantity. But I think Argentina and Brazil are really vital to global supply, but not just through the product, also through know-how, through understanding how you achieved it. So good question, thank you.
Sí,
last question from the public, because...
Okay.
I arrived late to the presentation, so maybe what I'm going to ask you talked about. Experimentation involves change with respect to the current system. The current system is what the farmer considers profit maximizing fertilizer level, for example, or a seeding date. Now, experimentation requires the farmer to change what he is currently doing. So how do you go about in convincing him to change, at least at the plot level?
Yeah. Good question, very good question. My first question to the farmer would be, how do you know it's maximized? How do you know it's maximized if you haven't varied it? Because even if you maximize it in 1 year, it could be that over 5 years, you're way far away from maximization. It could also be that in a dry year, this area over here, really, you shouldn't do it. It's not maximized for there. So that would be my first question, is how do you know you're maximized? If the farmer says, I think I'm maximized and I can demonstrate it by just, for example, with nitrogen, I'm just going to vary my nitrogen slightly and we'll look at the results, but I'll bet you 1,000 pesos that in actual fact the reality will be some way from what the farmers know. And it's not the farmers are uneducated or ignorant. It's just that all decision makers have to deal with very large amounts of information. And particularly in farming, you have very little data. Without data, it's very difficult to know if you are actually maximizing or optimizing towards your objectives, the system. It's been shown, psychologists have shown time and time again that farmers and all managers tend to do things like they go back to the average. So when they think of something maybe over the last 10 years. But that's not necessarily what happens in this place over here or in this particular year. It's not that they're ignorant, it's just that they don't know without data. The other things that farmers do is that they're very poor, like all managers or all people, they're very poor at actually managing probabilities and statistics. And by this, I mean, here's an example. When we were working in Australia in precision agriculture, one of the first things we did is we converted the yield maps to gross margin maps. Okay, everybody does that now, I guess, but we did it sort of 30 years ago to talk with the farmers. And what we saw was that about 30% of the farmer's land didn't really make much money at all. And so we asked the farmer, well, why are you farming this area over here? It makes no money for you. You'd be better off just putting that money somewhere else. He said, I know it doesn't make money, it didn't make money, but sometimes it does really well. So we gathered data over a number of years and found that even when it did well, it didn't make enough money to actually pay for all of the years when it lost money. Now, that sort of calculus is fairly straightforward, but it's almost impossible for a human being to carry all that information in their head without data and simplified analysis. And so that's what I'm saying, is that you need the data and the experimentation to actually improve their thinking, very complex thinking that farmers do. I'm sorry, I hope I answered your question. If not, we'll talk over Tinto.
There's one more for me, but that's what the companies, the input companies, the seed companies, the fertilizer companies do. They, maybe the first year they lend you a bag of the new seed, try it in one row, and then tell me about it. Is something like that, or is it's just marketing? No?
Well, we were working with a large fertilizer company in Australia, and we put out these big experiments. They did about 10 or 15 of them, and they enjoyed it. But halfway through the process, I was talking to their representative, and I was saying, "Well, you like this?" He said, "Yes, we really like this process." I said, "Yes, but you realize that it might mean that some of your clients will actually buy less fertilizer because it will show where they're overusing fertilizer. They're not getting their money back." He said, his response was very good, actually. He said, "I don't care." He said, "For us, it's about establishing trust between us, our product, and their business." And he said, "It's more important for me," and some of these growers would be spending $1 million or $2 million a year on fertilizer, and he's saying it's more important for me to keep them as a trusted customer than for us to try and make money out of them this year. So that's all about knowledge and trust in the product.
Okay, that's it.
Gracias.
Thank you very much, Simon. Thank you, Eddie.
Thank you all.
Gracias
Thank you.
a todos por haber venido, a los que están escuchando.
Thank you very much.